I wasn't supposed to be working that night. I'd promised Kenny I'd show up for his birthday. 40 years old, backyard barbecue at his place in Montrose. His wife making that apple pie I'd complimented once, and immediately regretted because she's made it every time she sees me since. I left the house fully intending to go. I made it to US 550 North. Then I opened the app, accepted the first ride that came up, and drove in the wrong direction. I didn't have a good reason for it. Sometimes you make choices like that. No clear motive, no idea yet that you'll spend the rest of the year trying to figure out what would have been different if you'd just gone to the damn barbecue. They were waiting out front of a motel on Dallas Street, near the north exit of Ridgeway. 2 passengers, a man and a woman, both around 30. The man got in first, carrying a large backpack he wedged between his legs without offering to put it in the trunk. The woman got in on the other side and shut the door harder than she needed to. It wasn't a fight. It was tension, the kind that hangs in the air when 2 people have been arguing all day and temporarily stopped. "Engineer Overlook?" I asked, just to confirm. "That's it," he said. "Take 550 North and we'll tell you when to turn off." She didn't say anything. She kept her face to the window. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed north. The night was cold, around 43 or 44 degrees, and there was a low fog settling over the open fields between Ridgeway and the first rise of the San Juans. I had the heat on low, the radio down on some country station I wasn't really listening to. It was about 10 minutes in when I noticed the camera. It was sitting on the back seat between the 2 of them, propped at a slight angle. A big camera with an interchangeable lens, the kind serious photographers carry, not the compact thing anyone throws in a bag for a trip. But what made me look twice was the position. It was tilted forward, pointed toward the gap between the front seats. It wasn't inside the backpack. The lens cap wasn't on, it was just sitting there, like someone had set it down in a hurry in the middle of something else. I thought about saying something. I didn't. Not my business. "Do you know any shortcuts other than what the app's showing?" the man asked. "I know the area pretty well," I said. "I worked truck maintenance out here for about 8 years before I switched jobs, but Engineer Overlook isn't a name I hear much. It's not on any of the regular routes." "It's not," he agreed. "That's exactly why we want to go." The woman turned her head slightly like she was about to say something, then stayed quiet. I kept driving. The road started climbing past the mountain access interchange, and the headlights cut through the fog at narrow angles. The wooden fences marking the properties along 550 faded out as the asphalt gave way to packed gravel that the app's routing treated like a normal road. "Will there be signal the whole way?" I asked. "Probably not," he said. "Then the route stops working." "I know the way," he said. "You can trust me." There was no logical reason to trust him, and I knew it. But he didn't say it like a threat. He said it like someone who'd made that drive before, and was a little tired of having to explain that. That's when the woman spoke to me for the first time directly. "Mr. Calloway." She'd read my name from the app profile. "You can still turn around," she said. "We'll pay the fare and you can drop us right here." "Mara," the man said, his voice low. "I'm talking to him, Joel." Silence. "It's all right, ma'am," I said. "I'm fine with the ride. But if there's something I should know about where we're headed, now's the time to say it." Joel opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "It's a remote area, no cell coverage. The access road has some rough patches, but your car can handle it. When we get there, we'd need you to wait in the parking area for about 40 minutes, maybe an hour. I'll pay double the fare for the wait. And if I don't want to wait, then we'll need to find another driver," he said, no edge in his voice. But that'd be tough at this hour. I thought about it for a few seconds, double fare on a 40-minute ride, plus the wait, plus the drive back, a full night's work in a single run. "All right," I said. "But if I decide to leave early, the deal's off." "Fair enough," said Joel. Mara didn't answer. She kept looking out the window as the road climbed and the fog thickened and the lights of Ridgeway disappeared behind the curves. I turned the heat up one notch and kept going. The camera stayed propped on the back seat for the rest of the drive. I only thought about it later. The fact that it was aimed forward, not at the forest outside. Like someone wanted to film not what was beyond the windows, but what was inside the car. Joel told me to take an unmarked exit about 2 miles past where the asphalt ended. I almost missed it. It was more of a gap in the vegetation than an actual road. 2 parallel ruts in the gravel, separated by a thin strip of low grass down the middle, the kind that disappears in winter and comes back in spring without anyone needing to plant it. The headlights lit up the trees at the bend, and Joel said here with a calm that bothered me, because he'd said it in a way that made clear he'd been waiting for that turn, counting the distance from some last landmark only he knew. I pulled in slowly. The car, a 2019 Subaru Outback I'd bought specifically because it could handle bad roads, held up fine for the first 100 yards or so. Then the grade steepened, and the gravel got looser, and I dropped into first and stayed there. "How much further?" I asked. "About 20 minutes on this road," Joel said. "Maybe 25. Mara was quiet. She'd stopped looking out the window and had her head tilted slightly down, hands folded in her lap. I couldn't see her expression in the rear view, just her posture. The posture of someone praying or trying not to get sick, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. The fog had stayed behind when we left 5 and 50, but up here between the trees there was a different kind of dampness, thicker, coating the lower branches with a white film. The headlights caught it and built a kind of halo around each curve before it opened up. I drove slow and tried not to think about how long it would take to get back down if the car got stuck. That's when the deer showed up. 3 of them, on the right side of the trail, maybe 50 feet ahead. 2 adults and a younger one, the smaller one positioned slightly behind the other 2. They didn't bolt when the headlights hit them. They just stood there, and I slowed down expecting them to move. But they didn't move. I sat there for about 10 seconds with the engine idling, and all 3 animals stayed exactly where they were, completely still, like cardboard cutouts propped along the edge of the road. "Happens a lot up here," Joel said from behind me. "Go slow and they'll move." I eased forward. The deer finally shifted, but not away from the road. They took 2 steps to the side and stopped again, leaving just enough room for the car to pass. What made me slow down even more was where they were looking. All 3 had their heads turned toward the forest on the left side of the trail, not toward the headlights. The headlights should have been what grabbed their attention. Bright light, engine noise, exhaust smell. But they were looking somewhere else. I drove past them and kept climbing. I didn't say anything about it. There wasn't anything specific to say. The trail bent in a long curve to the right, and then opened into something closer to an actual road. Still gravel, but wider, with fresher tire tracks pressed into the mud along the edges. Joel told me we were about 5 minutes from the parking area. I asked him to flip on the dome light for a second because there was a drainage ditch on the left I hadn't seen until then. When the light came on, I noticed Joel had the camera in his hands. He wasn't filming. He was checking something on the rear display. Menus, settings, I couldn't tell what exactly. The backpack was open between his legs, and I caught a glimpse of what was inside. A large flashlight, what looked like a coil of cable, and a small metal case with side latches. I didn't get a better look before he noticed me watching and shifted the bag. "Filming equipment?" I asked. "Documentary," he said. "Local wildlife." Mara made a sound in her throat. It wasn't agreement. "At midnight," I said. "Some animals only come out at night," Joel answered. It was a technically reasonable answer. I accepted it because there was nowhere else for the conversation to go, and because the parking area appeared right after that. A flat patch of packed dirt with room for maybe 8 cars, completely empty, with a faded wooden sign that read, "Engineer Overlook Trail," and below it an arrow pointing toward a narrow path climbing up between the pines. I parked and left the engine running. Joel got out first. He put on his backpack and stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the trail, then up at the sky, then back at the trail. The sky was open up there, no clouds, full of stars, with that cold, high-altitude clarity that makes everything feel quieter than it actually is. I had to be somewhere around 10,000 feet. The air that came in when he opened the door smelled like pine and wet earth, and something deeper I couldn't place right then. It reminded me of animal, or something organic decomposing slowly, preserved by the cold instead of broken down by it. Mara got out next. She stood outside with her hand still on the door, looking at me through the open gap. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "if you hear anything, and you want to leave, leave." "Mara," Joel said, same low voice as before. "I mean it," she went on, ignoring him, eyes fixed on mine. "You don't have any obligation to stay here." I wanted to ask what she expected me to hear, but the way she said it, not as a generic warning, but as a specific instruction based on something she already knew, made me keep my mouth shut. "I'll stay until you get back," I said. "If it's more than an hour, I'm gone." Joel nodded, satisfied. Then he turned toward the trail and started up without waiting for her. Mara stood there 2 or 3 more seconds. Then she closed the car door carefully, this time without force, almost gently, and followed him up the trail. In less than a minute, both of them had disappeared into the pines. I sat there with the engine running, the heat on low and the radio with no signal putting out white static that I left on, because the silence outside was the kind I preferred not to hear without something else in between. It was 11:42 when I checked the dashboard clock. I decided I'd wait until 12:40. Not an hour and 48 minutes, the exact amount of time I'd spent climbing up from Ridgeway. I don't know why that symmetry felt important. Sometimes you hold on to numbers when there's nothing more concrete left to hold on to. 48 minutes is enough time to think about a lot of things. I thought about Kenny, who at that point was probably opening his second bag of charcoal and complaining that I never show up. I thought about my right shoulder, which had started hurting again the past week for no apparent reason. The orthopedist had told me that would happen in winter, and I'd said sure like I knew what sure meant when you lose a 20-year career because of a joint. I thought about the Subaru, which needed an alignment I'd been putting off because getting your alignment fixed costs money, and driving with bad alignment also costs money, just slower. I didn't think about the 2 people who'd gone up the trail. That bothers me now. At the time, I rationalized it like this: adults make adult decisions, and their decisions weren't my problem beyond the unspoken agreement to pick them up when they came back. But there's another part, one I took longer to admit. I had taken that ride because the strange conditions were exactly what made me accept it. Not in spite of them, because of them. 8 months earlier, I'd handed the shop keys to my business partner after my shoulder stopped working right. 22 years fixing engines, and overnight I was driving for other people instead of fixing what made them run. That's not the kind of change you process in any kind of order. You only realize months later that you'd been taking anything that felt different from one more ride between 2 familiar points, one more forward exchange with someone staring at their phone in the back seat, a mysterious couple, an unmarked road, double pay to wait in the dark. It was the most interesting thing that had happened in weeks. That's the truth I didn't tell the investigator when she asked why I hadn't turned down the ride. It embarrasses me a little, but it is what it is. I kept the engine running for about 3 minutes after they disappeared into the pines. Then I shut it off. Ex-mechanic doesn't let an engine idle for no reason. It's wear, it's fuel, it's noise that drowns out everything around you. I left the key in the accessory position to keep the dash and radio on. The fan was still pushing out the last of the stored heat, but I knew that wouldn't last. The quiet that came in when the engine stopped was thicker than I expected. Not the silence itself, the kind of silence. I'd been sitting there a few minutes with the engine running, and during that time there'd been a constant background of small sounds. Crickets somewhere lower on the slope, the intermittent wind moving the upper branches, something I'd loosely identified as an owl working somewhere to the right of the trail. Sounds I hadn't consciously noticed because they were continuous, and continuous sounds become background, not foreground. When the engine stopped, I realized all those sounds had stopped too. Not after the engine. Before. I'd only noticed now because the engine had been masking their absence. I had no idea how long the silence had already been there. I sat there watching the tree line on the left. The headlights were off. The only light came from the dashboard, and a sliver of moon that appeared and disappeared as clouds passed over. There was nothing visible between the pines except layers of dark in different shades. I turned on the headlights. The forest was empty. Trunks, branches, shadows between them. Nothing moved. I kept the headlights on and put my hand on the ignition key. Not to start the engine, but because I needed something solid to hold on to. The cold metal of the key. Something real. The crickets didn't come back. It was 11:56 when I noticed something was wrong with the smell inside the car. It wasn't strong. It was subtle, the kind of thing you register first as a vague wrongness before you can name it. It took me about 30 seconds to place it. Meat. Not rotten, not fresh. Somewhere in between with a metallic undertone that reminded me of the inside of an old refrigerator after you unplug it and the cold starts bleeding out. I looked at the back seat. Empty. The camera had gone with Joel. So had the backpack. The seat was clean except for a small dark stain on the left headrest that I hadn't noticed before, and that could have been anything. Hair grease, road grime, anything. But nothing that explained the sour smell. I looked back at the forest. I picked it up through the dashboard sounds. The speedometer was sitting at 0, the key on accessories, and the only sound that should have existed was the occasional wind. But there was another rhythm layered over it, slower, with a cadence that didn't match any mechanical or natural element I could identify. It took me a while to separate the two sounds in my head. When I did, I understood what the second one was. It was coming from the right side of the car. I'd guess about 30 feet behind the point where the trail started, and it was too regular to be wind. I didn't turn my head to look directly at it. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because part of me understood that there was a difference between suspecting and confirming, and that once I confirmed something, there was no going back to the state before knowing. I kept looking straight ahead at the headlights hitting the faded Overlook sign, and I counted to 10 in silence. At 7, the sound stopped. Not gradually, it just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. The crickets came back about 2 minutes later. First one by itself, then the others one by one, like musicians coming in after a pause none of them had agreed on. The owl came back too. The wind moved the upper branches. 12:04. I should have left right then. Later, the investigator Patricia Holm asked me why I didn't, and I told her the agreement was to wait until 12:40. She wrote that down without comment, with the expression of someone who's heard worse versions of the same explanation. The fuller truth is that I didn't leave because the sound had stopped, and when something frightening stops, the human tendency, my tendency at least, is to read it as the end of the problem instead of the beginning of another one. It was 12:19 when the scream came down the slope. It wasn't a long scream. It was short, loud, cut off in the middle, the kind of sound a person makes when something interrupts what they were doing before they can finish reacting. It lasted less than 2 seconds. After that, nothing. I sat there with my hand on the key for about 5 seconds without doing anything. That bothers me when I think about it now. Not the fear, which was understandable, but the fact that my first thought wasn't someone got hurt, but was that a man or a woman, as if identifying the voice was the most urgent piece of information. It wasn't Joel. Of that I was certain. The pitch was higher, closer to what I'd expect from Mara, but the cutoff was too abrupt to be sure of anything. I started the engine. Not to leave, to have the option to leave. There's a difference, and at the time it felt important. I kept the engine running and the headlights pointed at the trail and waited. 30 seconds, 1 minute. The slope was quiet. The crickets kept going, the owl kept going, the wind kept going. Everything that had come back after the earlier silence was present and operating normally, as if the scream hadn't happened, or as if the forest had decided the scream wasn't its problem. That's when the second sound started. Vegetation being pushed through. Not the light kind a small animal makes moving under the brush. Something with weight, with volume, something that displaced whatever was in front of it instead of going around. The sound was high on the slope, clearly above the level of the parking area, and it was moving down and to the right relative to my car. I could hear the interval between displacements. 3-4 seconds of silence, then another heavy branch giving way, closer. It was coming down, not on the trail, along the side where there was no path. I put the car in reverse and kept my foot on the brake. I didn't back up, I just positioned myself. I wanted the option to move if I needed to, without losing time on the maneuver. 22 years fixing cars teaches you that the difference between a warm engine and a cold engine is time. And time in certain situations is the only currency that matters. The sound of vegetation stopped. Silence for about 8 seconds. Then, from the right side of the trail, about 60 feet ahead of my headlights, something crossed. Not slowly, not stealthily. It crossed in a direct line, right to left, on 2 legs, and disappeared into the tree line on the other side before I could fix any specific detail. What remained was impression, not image. A height incompatible with anything I'd expect to see on that road. A shift in the shoulders that didn't match how humans move. And the sound it made entering the vegetation on the other side. Not a rustle. An impact, like the trees had given way and snapped back hard. I kept staring at the spot where it had disappeared. The forest on the left was quiet. My first thought, and this is going to sound stupid but it's true, was elk. The area has elk. Elk are large. They rear up on their hind legs when startled. They can cross a road in seconds. That's what I thought for about 20 seconds while I sat there with my foot on the brake and my hands on the wheel, trying to sort what I'd seen into a known category. The problem was the height. A full-grown elk stands about 6 feet at the shoulder. What had crossed the trail was taller than the wooden Overlook sign, which I'd mentally estimated at around 7 feet when I parked. And it was on 2 legs. Not 4, 2, torso upright and the arms. There was no other word for it. The arms moving with its stride. I held those 2 facts in my head for a while without doing anything with them. It was 12:26 when I heard footsteps on the trail. Human footsteps. 2 feet uneven rhythm. Someone coming down fast without caring where they stepped. I kept the headlights aimed at the trail opening and waited, with the car still in reverse and my foot still on the brake, and about 40 seconds later Mara appeared at the edge of the headlights. She was standing, but wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Technically upright, technically moving toward me, but with something in her balance that wasn't right, like she was using the forward momentum to compensate for something pulling her sideways. There was dust on her jacket, her pants, her hair, a cut on the left side of her face that was bleeding steadily, not pouring but red enough to show under the headlights. Her hands were dark. She opened the passenger door and got in. The smell that came in with her was dirt, pine, cold sweat, and underneath all of it, that same metallic undercurrent I'd noticed earlier inside the car. Stronger now, unmistakable. "Get out of here," she said. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction, the kind you give when you've already calculated that an explanation takes time, and time is what you don't have. "Where's Joel?" I asked. "He fell," she said, "near the Overlook." There was no way to help. I looked at her. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield, hands in her lap, palms up, I noticed, as if she didn't want her fingers touching anything. "Fell how?" "In the dark. The ground up there is uneven." She paused. "Please, Dennis, get out of here now." It was the first time she'd used my first name. I took it out of reverse, put it in drive, and started down. The road back was narrow, and the headlights only caught what was directly ahead. Gravel, tight curves, both sides closing in with pines that seemed closer than they had on the way up. I drove slow because loose gravel on a descent demands it, and because part of my mind was still working through what had crossed the trail 3 minutes earlier. We'd gone about a quarter-mile down in silence when Mara said, without turning her head, "Something's following us." I already knew. I'd caught it in the left side mirror about 100 yards back. A movement between the trees, running parallel to the car, holding constant distance. It wasn't vegetation shifting in the wind. It was something adjusting its speed to match the car, slowing when I slowed and speeding up when I sped up, with the precision of something that wasn't moving in the same direction by accident. "I know," I said. She didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel and went another 200 yards before I saw, in the right mirror this time, an arm. Just the arm. Long, dark, passing between 2 close trunks with a movement that was neither furtive nor hurried. It was the movement of something that didn't need to hide because it had already calculated there was nowhere to go. I kept going down. The curve that put me off the road was about 600 yards below the parking area. Chapter 5. Mara comes back. The car went off the road on a curve I'd handled fine on the way up. The difference was speed. On the way up, I'd taken that curve at about 9 or 10 miles an hour, feeling the gravel shift under the tires and correcting before losing traction. On the way down, I was doing 18, maybe 22, because there was something in the mirror I didn't want getting closer, and my foot had gone heavy without me noticing. The curve tightened more than I expected. I corrected too late. The right side of the car left the gravel, caught the mud on the shoulder, and then it went fast. A drainage ditch that wasn't in the headlight's range, an impact that threw my head against the roof despite the seatbelt, and the car stopped at an angle, nose pointed down, front right wheel spinning in the air. Silence. Then the side airbag deflating with a sound like crumpled paper. I sat still for a few seconds, checking what still worked. Neck? Yes. Right shoulder. Hurt more than before, but it had hurt before too. Mara was beside me, leaning against the window, her hand on her face where the cut was. She was breathing. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, in the voice of someone who isn't completely but doesn't want to get into it right now. I tried reverse. The rear left wheel spun, through gravel, found nothing solid. The car groaned and didn't move. I killed the engine before pushing it further. Ex-mechanic, you learn that forcing a stuck car makes things worse, and sometimes breaks what was still working. "It's not coming out," I said. She was already opening her door. Outside the cold was drier than I expected, with that high-altitude cutting wind that takes the moisture from your breath and carries it off before you realize you're losing heat. I stood beside the car and assessed the situation with what I had. Headlights still working, angled down into the ditch, lighting up dirt and roots. The road was about 6 feet above where we'd stopped. No cell signal, I confirmed that before putting the phone away. Mara was standing at the edge of the road, looking up at the forest above us. "It's still up there," she said, not as a question. "I don't know," I said, and that was true. The mirror had shown me the arm about 600 yards back. Since the impact, I hadn't heard anything except the car and our own breathing. "It is," she said. I didn't argue. I started running through our options out loud, less for her and more to organize my own thinking. Walking down to 550 was about 2 miles of unlit road. Going back up to the parking area made no sense. Staying next to the car meant staying at a fixed known point, which felt like the worst of the 3 options given what I'd seen in the mirror. It was Mara who mentioned the tunnel. "There's a maintenance entrance about 200 yards down," she said, "on the right side of the slope. Joel researched the area before we came. There's a map of the mountain's drainage system on file with the county." I looked at her. "He researched the drainage system." "He researched everything," she said, in a tone that was neither pride nor criticism, just exhaustion. That's how he worked. We went down along the road's edge, me with the phone flashlight pointed at the ground because that's what we had. Mara a step ahead as if she knew the way, even without ever having been there before. Maybe because she'd heard Joel describe the place enough times to have a mental map of what he'd studied. The tunnel entrance was exactly where she'd said. A metal door, wide enough for maintenance equipment with a lock that had rusted into a half-open position. Not all the way, but enough for 2 adults to squeeze through. I pushed with my good shoulder. The door gave with a sound that echoed more than I expected. We went in. The inside smelled like damp concrete and something organic that had grown on the walls and died without enough light to keep going. It was a drainage tunnel, low ceiling, about 6 feet high, wide enough to walk side by side if both people were on the thin side. The phone flashlight reached about 12 feet ahead before the curve swallowed the rest. I pulled the door shut behind us as far as it would go. We stood in the partial dark for a few seconds, listening. Outside, nothing. Then, and I'd rather not have heard it, the sound of vegetation being displaced close, lasting about 3 seconds and then stopping. Mara put her back against the wall and slid down to the floor. She sat with her knees bent, looking at the door. "You need to tell me what happened up there," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to talk. It was the silence of someone deciding where to start. "The trip wasn't a hike," she said finally. "I'd gotten there on my own. Joel's father disappeared here. Not right here, in the general area around this overlook, about 15 years ago. The police closed the case as a trail accident. But before he disappeared, he'd called the family saying he'd seen something he couldn't explain. Joel grew up with that story. She paused. You know how it is when something becomes the center of a person's life without them realizing it. I knew. I didn't say anything. He wanted to prove his father's story was real. Film it, document it, bring back enough evidence that someone would take it seriously. That's what was in the backpack. Camera equipment, trail cameras, directional microphones. He'd been planning this trip for 2 years, and you came with him. I tried to stop him until the last minute, she said. But if I didn't come, he was coming alone. I paused before the next question because I knew the answer would change something. He didn't fall, I said. It wasn't a question, she understood that. No, she said. When it appeared, he tried to get closer. He wanted to film it up close. I ran. She looked at her own hands. I left him there. The blood on her hands was Joel's. I'd already thought that, but hearing the indirect confirmation, she had held on to him, or he had held on to her, and at some point one hand had let go of the other, made the thought heavier than when it was only a suspicion. Then I thought of something else. Mara, I said, with a calm that wasn't natural but was necessary. When you got in the car back there, you grabbed my arm. She looked at me. The blood on your hands, I continued. It's on the sleeve of my jacket. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It was the silence of 2 people arriving at the same place at the same time. Outside the metal door, something stopped and went quiet. I stood there staring at the door long enough to realize I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly. The air came out warm and visible in the cold of the tunnel. I hadn't noticed how cold it was until I could see my own breath. Mara was on her feet now, pressed against the wall opposite the door, eyes fixed on the rusted metal as if she could see through it. Outside, nothing moved. It wasn't the same silence as before. That empty silence where the crickets stopped and the whole forest suspended itself. This was a silence of presence. The difference is hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it, but it exists. An empty room makes one kind of silence. A room with someone standing still in the corner makes another. He knows we're here, Mara said very quietly. Maybe, I said. It's not maybe. I didn't argue. I looked at my jacket. The right sleeve had a dark, irregular stain about 4 inches above the wrist, where Mara had grabbed me when she got in the car. It wasn't large, but it was enough. The problem with smell is that you can't remove the source by wiping the surface with your hand. The blood had soaked into the fabric. As long as the jacket was on my body, the smell was on my body. That was the logic, and I followed it to its conclusion before I wanted to get there. I took off the jacket. Mara watched me do it without saying anything. It was cold without it. That tunnel cold that's different from open-air cold, stiller, harder to ignore. I held the jacket in my hand for a moment and swept the inside of the tunnel with the phone flashlight. To the right, about 50 feet ahead, there was a fork. The main corridor continued straight, sloping down slightly. The branch to the right was narrower, with a metal grate in the ceiling that appeared to be part of the ventilation system. I could see by the flashlight that it ended a few yards further at a wall with a circular grated opening. I walked to the fork. The ventilation grate was rusted, but the circular opening was about 2 feet across, tight but workable. Through the flashlight on the other side, I could see the reflection of vegetation, an exterior exit. I went back to where Mara was. There's a ventilation exit back there, I said. About 50 feet, we can get through. She looked in the direction I'd pointed, then at the metal door. What about the jacket? She asked. I'll throw it down the main corridor. If it comes in and follows the smell, it'll go straight. We go out through the vent. She was quiet for a moment. Will it work? She asked. I don't know, I said. That was the honest answer. Outside the door, the silence shifted. There was no sound, but there was a different pressure in the air. The kind of subtle change you feel when something large moves close to an enclosed structure. Like when a heavy truck passes near a warehouse and the walls respond before you hear the engine. We go now, said Mara. We walked slowly to the fork, me keeping the flashlight low to save battery. When we reached the split, I threw the jacket down the main corridor with enough force to send it far. It hit the wall about 30 feet ahead and fell onto the wet floor. We went into the narrow branch. The ventilation corridor was low enough that I had to bend my neck. Mara moved through more easily. The floor was concrete with a thin layer of accumulated sludge, and every step made a suction sound I desperately wanted to stop making but couldn't avoid. I counted the yards. 5, 8, 12. It was at the 12th yard that the metal door back there opened. Not with force. That's what surprised me. It wasn't broken through, wasn't the kind of brute strength I'd associated with the thing since I'd seen it cross the trail. It was the sound of metal giving gradually, as if something had applied steady pressure at a specific point until the rusted lock decided the resistance wasn't worth it anymore. A slow groan. Then the sound of the door hitting the inside wall of the tunnel. Then footsteps. Footsteps on concrete. Heavy, with a longer interval between them than any human stride. 4 steps. 5. Moving toward the main corridor. A pause. Mara was ahead of me, already at the ventilation grate, working her fingers along the rusted edge. I stayed still and listened. The footsteps had stopped. There was a breathing sound now. Low, steady, coming from the main corridor. The same rhythm I'd picked out over the car dashboard sounds earlier, separated from the wind by its unnervingly constant cadence. The sound stopped for about 3 seconds, then started again farther away, going down the main corridor toward where I'd thrown the jacket. Mara tore the grate off. The sound was too loud for the enclosed space, rusted metal giving all at once, a crack that echoed through the entire tunnel. She was already pushing through the opening before the echo died. I went after her, good shoulder first, then my head, then the rest of my body however it would fit. Outside was forest, sloped ground, dense vegetation, sky visible in patches between the branches. The ventilation opening was on the side of the slope, about 10 feet above the level of the gravel road, and there was a drop I decided not to calculate before jumping. I jumped. My right shoulder registered the impact with a kind of pain I noted and filed away to deal with later. Mara was already on her feet, looking up the slope. "Run!" she said. I ran. The gravel road was below us, and we came down the slope diagonally, grabbing branches to control our speed. No flashlight because the phone battery had been at 8% when I'd checked inside the tunnel, and I didn't want to burn what was left. The moonlight was enough to see by. Not well, not comfortably, but enough to stay on your feet. When we reached the gravel road, I looked back. The ventilation opening was visible on the slope. Dark. Empty. We stood there for about 10 seconds, listening. From inside the tunnel, nothing. From the forest above us, nothing. The wind moved the upper branches. Somewhere in the distance, an animal I couldn't identify made a short sound and stopped. "Is it still in there?" Mara asked. "I don't know," I said. But as I said it, I was looking at the tree line to our left where the slope climbed back up toward the Overlook, and there was something that wasn't right about the way the shadows fell between the trunks. A density at one particular point that didn't match the pattern around it. I didn't say anything about that. I turned toward the road and kept going down. We made it about a quarter mile down the gravel road before Mara stopped. She stood in the middle of the road with her hands on her knees, breathing hard. It wasn't complete exhaustion. It was the kind of stop the body demands when adrenaline starts to ease off, and your systems realize they've been running above their limit for too long. I knew that feeling. After accidents at the shop, after situations that required fast movement and fast thinking at the same time, there was always that moment when the body presented its bill. I stood beside her and listened to the forest, wind in the upper branches. Nothing else. "Can you keep going?" I asked. "Yes," she said, and started moving again before I could offer anything. The problem was the distance. I'd estimated 2 miles to 550, but that estimate was based on the drive up. On foot, on a slope, in the dark, with 8% battery left on the phone. The real distance was a different conversation. Mara had on hiking shoes, which helped. I had on loafers, which didn't. I noticed my right foot about 100 yards later. Something was off in my stride. Not quite pain, more of an irregularity, like the sole had given way on impact when I jumped from the slope. I looked down with what was left of the phone's light. The sole was partially detached at the front, opening like a mouth with every step. I kept walking. There was no practical alternative, so there was no point spending mental energy on the problem. About 5 minutes into the descent, Mara said, "You threw the jacket because of the smell." "Yeah, you knew that's what it was doing, tracking by smell." "It made sense," I said. "The smell inside the car before you got in. The deer on the way up looking into the forest instead of at the headlights. If smell is the primary sense, everything organizes around that." She was quiet for a moment. "Joel knew that too," she said. "It was in the records he'd researched. Reports from other incidents in the area years back. People who survived mentioned a smell before any visual contact." She paused. "He knew and went anyway." I didn't respond. There was nothing useful to say about that. The road curved long to the left and the terrain opened up a little. Fewer trees, more sky. The moon showing more clearly. You could see about 100 feet ahead without the flashlight. I used that to save battery, only turning it on at tight curves where the gravel changed texture and the drainage ditches crept closer to the edge. It was at one of those curves that I heard the branch. A single crack, dry, coming from the forest to the right. High on the slope, not immediately close, but the same quality of sound I'd heard in the parking area hours before. Weight on live wood before it breaks. I kept walking at the same pace. Mara had heard it too. She didn't speed up, didn't stop. She just moved one step closer to me than she'd been before, which I noticed by the change in the sound of her footsteps on the gravel. 30 seconds of silence. Then another branch, lower on the slope, closer to the road. "It came out of the tunnel," Mara said very quietly. "Yeah. When?" "I don't know. Maybe it didn't go down the main corridor at all. Maybe it turned back through the door and came around the slope." "How long before it reaches us?" It was an engineering question, not panic, and she wanted a number to work with. I respected that. "Depends on the terrain above the road," I said. "If it's dense, more time. If it finds the road and comes down it, less. Then we stay off the road." We left the right shoulder and moved into the vegetation running parallel to the road, going down at a diagonal. The ground was rougher, with exposed roots and loose rocks under a layer of wet leaves, but there was lateral distance from the road and branch cover above. The sole of my shoe opened another half-inch on the first root I hit, and I decided that was an acceptable loss. We went like that for a stretch of time I can't accurately estimate. Mara in front, me behind, neither of us speaking. Every so often I'd stop, listen, keep going. The sounds of breaking branches came at irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes distant, with no pattern I could use to calculate position or speed. It was something moving through the dark without needing a road, without needing a trail, without needing any path logic that made sense to me. It was Mara who stopped first. She'd raised her left hand, the universal gesture I'd learned at the shop from the foreman who used the same signal when he wanted the mechanics to stop making noise so he could listen to an engine. I stopped immediately. We stood still. To our right, about 50 feet up the slope, there was a breathing sound. Not the slow, steady rhythm I'd heard earlier in the car and in the tunnel. This was faster, shallower. The rhythm of something that had been moving hard and was recovering. And there was a direction to that sound that the version in the car hadn't had. It was above us but moving laterally along the slope, right to left, as if circling around something. Circling us. "Don't run," I said as quietly as I could. Mara went completely still. The breathing sound continued its lateral arc for about 20 seconds, then stopped. Complete silence. Then, to our left, about 30 feet down the slope, a wet leaf gave under weight. A single step. Then another, closer. I'd been facing the road downhill when we stopped, my back to the slope. I turned slowly. The moon was partially covered, but there was enough light to make out shapes. Trunks, shadows between them, the outline of the slope rising. There was something standing between two pines about 40 feet away. I didn't see all of it. I saw part, a shoulder, the curve of a back covered in something that was neither dense fur nor smooth skin, something in between, uneven, with thicker patches in some areas and visible stretched skin in others. The head was turned our way, but the face was in the shadow between the two trunks. Only the eyes caught the light. Not red, not flashlight bright, just the cold reflection animal eyes make when light hits them at the right angle, the same reflection a dog makes in a flash photo. It stood still. We stood still. I don't know how long it lasted. Time in situations like that doesn't work like normal time. It stretches or vanishes depending on where your attention is, and my attention was fixed on one very specific point between two pine trees 40 feet away. What happened next I still haven't fully processed. The thing lowered its back, not crouching but shifting its center of gravity, the front limbs coming down to the ground in a posture that wasn't natural for anything bipedal but that seemed to have its own logic, as if that body knew both modes and moved between them without effort. And then it went left, parallel to the slope, slow without taking its face off us, or at least without turning away from us, because eyes I could no longer see clearly. It disappeared behind the tree line. Mara and I stood there for another 30 seconds without moving. Then she took one step down the slope slowly, testing the ground before putting her weight down. I followed. We came down the remaining 200 yards to 550 without running, without talking, listening with every step. When Mara's feet touched the asphalt, she stopped and stood there for a moment, her back to me, looking at the empty road in both directions. Then she turned left toward Ridgeway without saying anything. I followed. Somewhere along the walk, I realized I had no jacket and that the cold had settled in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't just temperature. It was the cold that comes after, when the body finally understands it can stop running at its limit and decides to present everything it had been saving for later. It was around 3 in the morning, I estimated, when the lights of the first truck appeared on the straight stretch of 550. Mara didn't wave. I did. The truck was a road maintenance vehicle, an orange Ford F-750 with the Colorado Department of Transportation logo on the door, 2 auxiliary lights on the roof, and a tool cage on the flatbed that rattled against the gravel on the shoulder when the driver pulled over. Darren Fitch, mid-50s, gray mustache, thermal jacket with his name embroidered on the chest. He got out with the expression of someone who had stopped because stopping was protocol, not because he expected to find 2 adults on foot on a mountain road at 3 in the morning, looking like they'd fallen off something tall. "You folks okay?" he asked. "Car in the ditch," I said. "About 2 miles up." He looked at Mara, at the cut on her face, at her dark hands, at the posture that wasn't that of someone on a late-night walk. Then he looked at me, no jacket, shoe with the sole flapping open, right shoulder visibly higher than the left. "Anyone hurt up there?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. That was the true answer. Not the complete answer, but the true one. Darren drove us to Ridgeway in the cab. Mara stayed by the window, looking out for the whole ride. He tried conversation for about 2 minutes, the kind people make when they're with strangers in an undefined situation and need to fill the silence with something that feels normal. Then he gave up and kept his eyes on the road, which I silently appreciated. When we got to the gas station at the edge of Ridgeway, Mara got out before the truck had fully stopped. "Ma'am," said Darren. She didn't stop. She went into the station, straight to the bathroom in the back, and closed the door. I stood outside the cab for a moment, watching the bathroom door through the storefront glass, trying to make a decision I couldn't quite form into a decision yet. Darren called the county sheriff on the truck's radio. I waited outside while he talked, sitting on a metal guardrail with my elbows on my knees, looking at the asphalt of 550 as it disappeared into the darkness heading north. The shoulder throbbed. My right foot had developed a blister where the open sole had been rubbing. I was hungry, a specific mundane hunger of someone who hadn't eaten in hours, and for one completely idiotic moment, I found myself wondering if the station had sandwiches at that hour, and what they'd cost, and whether I had my wallet. I did. In my pants pocket where it always was. I went in and bought a wrapped turkey sandwich and a bottle of water. The attendant was a woman around 50, who looked at me with the restrained expression of someone trained not to ask questions, but who clearly had several. I paid, took my change, went back to the guardrail. I ate half the sandwich before I realized I wasn't tasting any of it. The bathroom door was still closed when the sheriff's car arrived, about 25 minutes after Darren's call. 2 officers, a younger one who stayed with Darren, and Sergeant Patricia Holm, who came to talk to me. She was direct, which I appreciated. No preamble, none of the overly gentle tone some officers use with witnesses that always struck me as preparation for a trap. She sat down on the guardrail beside me, opened a small notebook, and asked what happened. I told her. Not everything. Not the thing between the pines, not the eyes reflecting the moonlight, not the shoulder that had shifted posture transitioning between 2 modes of movement. I told her what was verifiable. The ride, the road, the couple, the scream, the car in the ditch, the tunnel, the walk. She took notes without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at her notebook for a moment. "And the boyfriend," she said. "Joel Voss. Still up there from what Mara told me. She said he fell. That's what she said in the car, right after the scream. Later she told me a different version." Holm looked at me. "Different how?" "She said when the thing appeared, he tried to get closer to film it. She ran." A pause. "What thing?" Holm asked. I looked at her. She looked at me. Her expression wasn't skepticism. It was more a kind of careful patience, the type that develops when you work a region where people occasionally came down from the mountains with stories that didn't fit any standard form. "A large animal," I said. "Very large. Bipedal at times, quadrupedal at others. Over 7 feet tall when upright." She wrote it down. She didn't say anything about what she'd written. Mara came out of the bathroom about 5 minutes later. She'd washed her hands and her face, and had tried to clean her jacket with wet paper towels, with partial success. The cut on her face had stopped bleeding but was swollen around the edges. She sat down on a plastic bench near the door, and the younger officer went to talk to her. I didn't hear what she said. I stayed outside with Holm, who had asked a few more questions about the exact location of the car and the tunnel entrance, and then had gone quiet, looking up 550 North with an expression I couldn't read. "There have been other reports," I said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer right away. "This area has a history of trail incidents," she said after a moment. "Most have explanations. Some don't. Joel Voss. His father disappeared here about 15 years ago." She looked at me differently than she had before. "How do you know that?" Mara told me in the tunnel. Holm closed her notebook. Not because she was done. It looked more like a reorganizing gesture, like someone who needs a second to put new information in the right place before continuing. "We'll go up as soon as it's light," she said. "With a team. We'll need you to show us where the tunnel is." "I'll be there." She went to talk to Darren. I was alone for a moment on the guardrail, holding the half sandwich I hadn't eaten, looking north. The sky was starting to change on the horizon line. Not light yet, just a shift in the gradation of dark. The kind of change you only notice if you've been staring long enough. It had to be around 5 in the morning. I went to the station window and threw away the sandwich. Through the glass, I could see Mara still sitting on the plastic bench, hands in her lap, looking at the floor. The officer had stepped away to make a call. She was alone, completely still, with the posture of someone who had arrived somewhere inside themselves and was staying there for now, in no hurry to leave. I went in and sat down on the bench beside her. She didn't look up. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked. She was quiet for a while. "I don't know what that means anymore," she said. I understood. I didn't say that I understood because it would have sounded hollow, but I did. We sat in silence until the sky lightened enough for Holm to come back and say it was time to go up. Mara didn't go with the team. I did. The car was where I'd left it, tilted in the ditch, front bumper crumpled and the right wheel still in the air. The tunnel was there, the metal door pushed open inward the way I'd left it. Inside, in the main corridor, the jacket was on the floor where I'd thrown it, but torn with 3 parallel marks in the fabric that hadn't come from hitting the wall. Joel's camera they found in pieces, scattered along the trail above the parking area. Lens separated from the body, memory card snapped in two. The track started at the parking area and headed into the woods in a northeast direction. Holm measured one of them with the tape she carried and didn't tell me the result, but I saw the number she wrote in her notebook. Of Joel Voss, they found nothing. Of Mara either. Mara had given the deputy an address in Seattle, signed the preliminary statement, and refused medical transport. Holm had asked her to remain available, but there was no legal reason to hold her. By the time they realized the phone number she'd given was disconnected, she was already gone. Investigator Holm called me 3 times the following month. The first time was a week later, to confirm details about the tunnel's location and the direction we'd come down the slope. The second was 2 weeks after that, to let me know the car had been recovered and that Joel Voss's case had been formally opened as a missing person. The third was a month later, on a Tuesday afternoon when I was lying on the couch staring at the ceiling for no particular reason, and she said they'd found something. The camera's memory card was snapped in two, she said, but the break didn't reach the main storage sector. A technician was able to recover part of the footage. I stayed quiet. I'm not going to describe the contents in detail, she continued, but it confirms the presence of a large animal in the area. The footage isn't conclusive enough for taxonomic identification. It is sufficient to confirm that your account is consistent with what was recorded. What happens to the footage? It's part of the case file as evidence. For now, it stays in the county archive. And the case? A pause. Joel Voss's case remains open as a disappearance. Another pause, shorter. There are no immediate plans for public release of the footage. I understood what she wasn't saying. I also understood there was a practical reason for that, which had nothing to do with a cover-up, and everything to do with the kind of problem that footage like that would create in a region that depended on hiking and hunting tourism for 8 months of the year. I didn't say anything about that understanding. Thanks for calling, I said. She hung up. I lay on the couch for another 20 minutes staring at the ceiling before I got up and made coffee. The shoulder got worse in winter, the way the orthopedist had promised. I did physical therapy twice a week in Montrose through January and February, at a clinic in a strip mall between a mattress store and a pharmacy, and the physical therapist was a young, competent man who never asked questions about how the injury had suddenly gotten worse. I was grateful for that discretion every week without saying so. I stopped accepting rides in November, right after Holmes' call. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just stopped opening the app, and when I noticed I'd stopped, I didn't reopen it. I was living off the savings I'd set aside during the transition from the shop to rideshare, which were enough for about 5 months without work if I was careful. And I was. Kenny showed up one December afternoon with a case of beer and the excuse that he was passing through Ridgeway and decided to swing by, which was a lie because Ridgeway isn't on the way to anywhere Kenny normally goes. We sat on the porch in our coats until it got dark, drinking and talking about other things. His wife, the renovation he was doing on his garage, a mechanic who'd opened a new shop in Montrose and was gouging people on alignments. At no point did he ask about the night at the Overlook. That did me good in a way I hadn't expected. Having someone show up, stay, talk about things that didn't matter, and leave without me needing to explain anything. When he left around 8, I went inside and stood in the kitchen for a while, not knowing quite what to do with the fact that I'd spent 3 hours without thinking about the Overlook once. The next day I thought about it twice as much as usual. I don't know if there was a connection. Probably not. The nightmare I kept having wasn't about the thing between the pines. It was about the jacket. In the dream, I was back in the tunnel, in the ventilation corridor, holding the jacket. But in the dream, I couldn't decide where to throw it. I stood at the fork while the footsteps got closer to the metal door, trying to calculate angles, distances, the probability that the smell would follow the main corridor and not the ventilation one. And the more I calculated, the less I could decide. And the footsteps kept getting closer, and I was still standing there with the jacket in my hand when the door opened. I woke up before seeing what came in. That was enough to keep me from sleeping again the rest of those nights. The physical therapist at a February session, when I'd clearly shown up on little sleep, asked in a neutral tone whether I was sleeping well. I said more or less. He noted something in my chart and mentioned a family doctor who saw patients in the same strip mall. I thanked him and didn't go. In March, I reopened the app. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was an ordinary Thursday morning when I had my phone in my hand, and the app was there and I opened it. I stared at the screen for about 2 minutes. Then I accepted a ride, a woman around 60 who needed to get to the dentist in Montrose and wanted company on the drive because her husband had fractured his hip in winter and she wasn't used to driving the highway alone. We talked for the entire 45-minute trip. She told me about her husband, about her kids who lived out of state, about a dog that had died the year before and that she still missed in a way that surprised her. I told her I'd been a mechanic, that now I drove, that Ridgeway was a good town for someone who didn't need much noise. When I dropped her at the clinic, she said thank you in a way that meant more than the ride. I drove back to Ridgeway with the window down, even in the March cold, and didn't think about the Overlook once during the 45-minute return. That lasted about 3 weeks. Then I went back to the regular pattern, some days without thinking about it, some days thinking about it more than I wanted to, with no clear logic I could use to predict or control it. Kenny told me once that trauma doesn't have a timeline, which is what his wife had told him after a motorcycle accident he'd had in 2019 that left him afraid of roundabouts for about 8 months. Not exactly the same scale of problem, but I understood the principle. I avoided mountain roads. Not explicitly. I'd just redirect, suggest alternate routes, say the app was showing traffic one way and propose another. Most of the time it worked. Sometimes the passenger would insist and I'd agree and make the drive with my hands a little tighter on the wheel than necessary, and my eyes a little more on the tree line than the road. There was never anything in the tree line. That didn't help as much as it should have. It was on an ordinary night in May that the app pinged with a new request. I was in the supermarket parking lot in Ridgeway, a coffee I'd bought inside going cold in the cup holder, checking my phone with no particular intention. The notification came in like all the others. Passenger name, rating, distance, destination. I opened the profile because that was routine. The photo was small, the way all app photos are, and the phone screen had a grease smudge in the corner that slightly distorted the image. I stared at it for about 3 seconds before I understood what I was looking at. It was Mara, not a different Mara with the same name. It was her. The same face, the same haircut, the same contained expression I'd associated with her from the moment she'd gotten into the car that night. The rating was 4.8, with 23 rides logged, which meant the profile had history. It wasn't new. The username was M. Voss. Voss, Joel's last name. The destination she'd entered was in the field below the photo, in small, precise letters, with the coordinates auto-generated by the app from a pin she'd dropped on the map. Engineer Overlook. The same Overlook. I sat there with my finger hovering over the accept button, staring at the screen, coffee going cold in the cup holder, the supermarket parking lot lit up all around me, and 550 visible through the car window pointing north toward the mountains. The app showed the request had been sent 48 seconds ago. After 60 seconds with no response, it would expire automatically. I kept my finger hovering. The app expired, not because I'd declined, because the 60 seconds ran out while I sat there with my finger over the screen, and the system made for me the decision I hadn't been able to make on my own. The screen went back to the default map, Ridgeway, the available ride markers in the area, the line of 550 heading north the way it always had. I stared at the map for a while. Then I set the phone in the cup holder, next to the coffee that had gone completely cold, and sat in the parking lot with my hands on the wheel and the engine off. The supermarket closed at 10. There were about 4 cars in the lot besides mine, and a woman came out through the automatic doors pushing a cart with 2 bags, and a small child in the seat who was eating something orange. A carrot, maybe, or one of those little fish-shaped crackers. The woman went to a white Honda Civic, moved the bags to the trunk, got the child into the back seat with the quick automatic efficiency of someone who does that 50 times a week, and left. I kept sitting there. I tried to organize what I knew in order. Mara had disappeared from the gas station while I was on the mountain with Holmes' team. Nobody had seen her since. Not formally, not in any way I'd been informed of. Joel's case remained open as a disappearance. Hers, I assumed, as well. And now there was an app profile with Joel's last name, and a photo that was unmistakably her. With 23 rides logged over a span I couldn't calculate precisely, but that suggested months of regular use. What that meant in practical terms I didn't know. I knew what the destination meant. The phone rang again. Not an app notification, a call, a number I didn't recognize, Ouray County area code. I answered. Calloway. It was home. Investigator, I said. Are you in Ridgeway? Smith's parking lot. Why? A short pause. We had an incident early this afternoon. A hiker coming down from Engineer Mountain reported finding abandoned equipment near the Overlook. A backpack, some personal items. She paused again. Among the items was an ID, Washington State driver's license. I closed my eyes for a second. Name? I asked, even though I already knew. Mara Voss, said Holm. Born 1995, address in Seattle. A pause. Calloway, have you had any contact with her since November? Not directly, I said. Holm stayed quiet on the other end, waiting. She sent a ride request through the app, I said. About 10 minutes ago. Destination Engineer Overlook. It expired before I accepted or declined. The silence that followed had a different texture from Holm's previous silences. It wasn't processing. It was the silence of someone deciding how much to say. I'm going to need you not to accept any rides to that area, she said finally. I wasn't planning to. And if she sends another request, call me before you do anything. Understood. She hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand for a moment, staring at nothing ahead. Through the passenger window I could see 550 North lit by the street lights at the edge of town, and beyond the lights the darkness where the road climbed toward the mountains. From here you couldn't see the San Juans, just the road disappearing around the bend and then nothing. I thought about Mara in the tunnel, sitting on the floor with her palms facing up. I thought about the 23 rides on the profile, 23 trips she'd taken somewhere, at some point over the past few months, using the last name of a man who had disappeared on a mountain because of an obsession she'd tried to stop, and from which she'd run at the decisive moment. I didn't know what to do with that. There was nothing useful to do with it right now, in this parking lot, on this night. I thought about the driver's license found near the Overlook. There were two possible interpretations, and I recognized both of them with the cold clarity of someone who'd spent 11 months developing the habit of thinking through bad possibilities, far enough in advance not to be caught off guard. The first was that Mara had gone back to the Overlook on her own, for reasons I couldn't fully imagine, but that had some logic within what I knew about her, and had left the license behind, accidentally or not. The second was that someone had put it there. There was no third interpretation I could honestly formulate. The app pinged again, not a call this time. A notification, new request, 2-kilometer radius. I'd forgotten to close the app after the first request expired, and the system was still sending me available rides in the area as if it were just another ordinary Thursday night. I looked at the screen. Name, M. Voss. Rating, 4.8. Distance, 0.9 miles. Destination, Engineer Overlook. The same request. She'd sent it again. I stared at the photo, the small image, the grease smudge in the corner of the screen slightly distorting the left side of her face. Same expression. 4.8 with 23 rides, which meant that nobody who had driven with her had found reason to complain, or nobody had been in a position to complain afterward. I knew what Holm had said. I also knew what was at Engineer Overlook. I'd been there. I'd seen the thing cross the trail on 2 legs, heard the footsteps in the tunnel, held the jacket with Joel's blood on it, and made a decision that had bought us enough time to get out. That knowledge wasn't abstract. It was the kind that lives in the body, in the shoulder that ached more in winter, in the shoe sole I'd thrown away that morning and replaced with a new pair that had never felt completely right since. And yet, Mara had been up there before me. She'd seen what there was to see, had made the choices she'd made, choices I was in no position to judge because I hadn't been in the same position, and she'd survived. She'd spent 11 months somewhere making 23 rideshare trips and made it back to Ridgeway. On the same night, a team found her license near an overlook that didn't appear on any tourist map. There was a version of Mara who had come back because she needed something that only existed up there. There was a version of Mara who hadn't come back. The app showed 41 seconds remaining. 38. I put my thumb on the screen. Not on the accept button, not on the decline button. In the center of the photo. On her face. 32 seconds. 29. The parking lot was quiet. The 550 streetlights lit the edge of town with that sodium orange glow that makes everything look slightly unreal past a certain hour. Somewhere behind me, inside the supermarket, someone was pushing a cart across the linoleum floor. I could hear the wheels, uneven, one of them with some mechanical problem that made a dragging sound with every rotation. 21 seconds. I thought about Kenny saying trauma doesn't have a timeline. I thought about the 60-year-old woman talking about her dead dog for 45 minutes, as if I were the right person to hear it, and maybe I had been. I thought about the jacket torn on the tunnel floor, with the 3 parallel marks in the fabric. I thought about how Mara had been in 2 places at the same time tonight, at the Overlook, where the license had been found, and somewhere 0.9 miles from me, with a phone in her hand, waiting for my answer. 11 seconds. 8. Thumb hovering over the screen. 5. 4. 3. That's when I understood that the ride wasn't waiting for a driver. It was waiting for me.